or Executive Order N2920. To begin, all committee members and staff are unmuted. Please mute your devices yourself until you're ready to speak. To avoid feedback and background noise, then unmute yourselves to comment or respond, including roll calls. Committee members should only use the chat feature for meeting management purposes and not use it to engage in discussion. Members of the public are muted and video is off upon joining the meeting, but will be unmuted for public comments and questions. I will call for general public comment at item 2, then again for each separate agenda item. Comments are limited to 3 minutes. There are 3 options for public comments. You can indicate in the chat feature at any time during the item discussion that you wish to be called upon. You can write your question or comment in the chat feature, or when public comments begin, Tara will unmute all members of the public and you may verbally state your name and indicate that you have a question. Kathy Martin will time each public comment, advise you when your 3 minutes is up, and then your mic will be muted after a brief pause. Public comment can also be sent via email or mail. Please refer to the agenda for the specifics. Any public comments received via email or in writing after 2:30 p.m. today will be posted to the website the next day, all of which becomes part of the record. For each of the agenda items, I'll introduce the agenda item and the presenter. At the end of the presentation, I will ask the committee for any questions of the presenter. Members are asked to use the raise hand feature on Zoom, ideally, or otherwise signal verbally or visually. Please wait to be called upon. If we have lots of questions, I may go through in alphabetical order. I will then call for public comments, and then the committee may then discuss the item and public comments, and again, use the raised hand feature to be recognized before speaking. Today's PowerPoint was not included in your packet, but it was distributed earlier, I think earlier today. The PowerPoint will be shown during the meeting and will be available on the SCVGSA website. So now back to Tara for our roll call. Be ready for your mute, unmute.
I hope you're ready. It's time. Dan Masnada.
Here.
Roy Marson. No Roy. Sandra Cattell.
I'm here.
Stacy Fortner.
I'm here.
Dennis Ostrom.
Here.
Steve Sly.
Here.
Matt Carpenter.
Here.
Eric Adair.
Here.
Holly Schroeder.
Present.
I think that's the fastest we've ever done that record.
Ooh, we're getting better. We're getting better at the mute, unmute. Fabulous. All right, moving on to item 2, public comment. Tara, the floor is yours.
All right, I have unmuted everyone so they have control over their own muting. Anyone have any public comments?
I do. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
First of all, I wanted to apologize to the group for that errant meeting request that I believe you all received. I was trying to make a note to myself because I thought I'd heard a comment at the last meeting about, I forget the term, rampant over pumping or something. And I meant to put a note to myself in my calendar, and it actually went out as a meeting request. Again, I want to apologize to the committee, and in particular to Sandra, and she and I have talked, and once again, I'm sorry about that. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't want to let it go because I'm sure you all received that meeting request.
Thanks for that, Dan, and for clarifying what happened. I think we all know how meeting requests can, you can accidentally invite or update unintentionally. So I think we've all had our tech foibles over the past 10 months. Tara, is there anybody else scheduled for public comment that is requested?
Sandra, see, I didn't master the mute, unmute. Sandra, it looks like she's waving her hand.
Oh, Sandra, please.
I just wanted to mention, thank you, Dan. And I just wanted to let you all know that, you know, I sort of misspoke. It wasn't my intention to make it sound like there was rampant over pumping, but that was one of the things that we have to be concerned about because we're all here. You know, I may be the environmental seat here, but I think of us all as one team working for the environment, for water sustainability, groundwater sustainability. And I think we're a team, we're working together, and I appreciate being part of this team.
Great, thank you. Tara?
Anyone else? I see no hands raised and nobody speaking.
All right, with that, we will move on to approval of the minutes. Hopefully you've had a chance to look. If there's any changes, otherwise I would welcome a motion and a second.
Eric is waving his hand.
Thank you, Eric. That's a motion.
I'll second.
Oh, no, let me say, I think there.
Oh, you have a
I'm
comment?
sorry, I was on mute. I apologize. I think there's just a minor error in the count of who was present and who was absent last meeting. We're only accounting for 9 people. There's 10 people on the committee. I think the missing person is Dennis Ostrom, who I believe was present at the meeting. So the minute should be corrected to reflect that Dennis was present.
Actually, I think the person that was missing is Roy Marson, who has not been able to attend.
No, he's mentioned in the minutes as having been absent. The person who's not accounted for in the minutes as present or absent is Dennis. And I believe he just needs to be added to the present category.
Actually, I think that was the meeting that I was not present for. You
Correct.
chaired that one, correct?
Correct. And you're shown as absent.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. So it's that count. I
Got it.
get it.
Yeah, everything else is right. I just think we missed Dennis somehow. So I'll make a motion to approve the minutes with that correction, that Dennis be added to the committee members present category.
And I'll second the motion once that correction's made.
All right, we're all ready for the roll call drill.
I'm ready if you are.
Please
Okay.
proceed.
Dan Masnada,
Yes.
Sandra Cattell,
Yes,
Stacy Fortner,
Yes,
Dennis Ostrom,
Yes.
Steve Sly,
Yes.
Matt Carpenter,
Yes.
Eric Adair,
Yes.
Holly Schroeder.
Yes.
That passes.
All right. All right, we are moving on with our review of the technical memo on the sustainable management criteria. The criteria has been a topic for the past couple of meetings, and it's starting to come together. And I also appreciated the PowerPoint, the sort of review of where we are in the process. So thanks to that. With that, I will hand it over to Rick or Jeff, or who's going to kick us off here.
Thank you, Holly. I'll kick the group off. I'll cover a couple slides and then Jeff is going to go through the rest of the presentation. So Jeff, are you all queued up?
Just a moment.
Okay.
I'm trying to get the right screen to show up. Just a moment. Okay. Apologize for this. Okay, what is the problem here?
While we're waiting for Jeff to deal with the technical issues, we could review the handout if that's helpful. Rick, what do you think? Or do we want to wait until
Yeah,
we kind of got some more
I think
context?
Jeff will be ready pretty quick here. Unless, Jeff, do you want me to roll it?
Why don't you roll it, because for some reason my computer is not responding properly.
Okay, I'll do that. And then you can just tell me when we get into it to, when you want to advance them. Oh, who's that?
That's me. So can
You.
you see that,
Yay!
everybody? Yay.
Way to go.
Apologize. All right, Rick.
All right. Love technology. So we've been on a long road getting here today. This is actually, and your committee knows this, this is the 4th meeting that your committee's had on this sustainable management criteria. We had one in November, 2 in January, and we're gearing up towards the public workshop on March 10th. And so we sent out on February 10th links to the technical documents that were prepared. And I believe we sent out the PowerPoint, I think it was yesterday, might have been today, Holly, but, and so we're just kind of chipping away at this complicated topic. And we just wanted to thank your committee. We've incorporated your input as best we can in the process. And thank you for all your work along the way. We've got several meeting topics today. We'll review where we are in the process. That's the next slide. Jeff's going to go into what we've learned so far and talk more about the criteria and the process and provide summaries on the criteria for each of the sustainability criteria. And I think for those of you that have looked through the report, there's a lot of structure to the report that we're required to roll in for the DWR regulations. So Jeff will go over that, but not in anywhere the amount of detail is what's in all the written material that we forwarded. So Jeff, next slide, please. So just a quick recap on process. We're still here, moving up the stairs in establishing the sustainable management criteria. After this meeting, we'll move into the workshop on March 10th. After that workshop, we're going to move into projects and management actions and keep trucking on this overall process. And there's a lot more to go, and it's happening pretty quickly at this point. Your committee will receive a draft of the GSP in July or August, I recall. And we'll move pretty quickly after that to the GSA Board of Directors to have them look at the draft and ultimately consider approving it. So we're doing great, everybody. Thank you. We still got a ways to go. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff for going through the rest of the slides.
Thank you very much, Rick. So I wanted to set the stage for what we've learned so far because it has relevance to how we would choose to define the thresholds and the criteria for evaluating sustainability. So we've not seen what are called undesirable results thus far for each of the indicators. The groundwater levels clearly have been highly variable depending on climate, but overall, they've been stable over the long term, both for the alluvium and for the Saugus. The water budget analysis, which we've presented in the past, indicates that there's sufficient recharge to balance the pumping according to the operating plan now, but also in the future based on the groundwater modeling that we've done looking at future conditions, including climate change. Water quality clearly has been impacted in some locations by contamination. The state regulatory agencies oversee investigation and cleanup of contamination, and wellhead treatment has been employed by SCV Water at a number of locations. River habitat is supported by groundwater and has been resilient through historic droughts. You clearly have seen that. Avoiding undesirable results, however, to groundwater dependent ecosystems from groundwater pumping is critical. Groundwater trigger levels have been established for evaluation and response. And we're going to talk a little more about that, but we've discussed that in the past as well. So what is the purpose of these sustainable management criteria? Well, we want to avoid undesirable results. We want to provide criteria and thresholds by which we can measure and evaluate sustainability on an ongoing basis, kind of how we're doing. And likewise, while we have not observed undesirable results, we want to be able to anticipate conditions that could lead to undesirable results in the future. You all have seen this graphic in the past. I'm not going to go into excruciating detail, but you can see that in the development steps for sustainability criteria, there are a number of steps. understanding basin conditions, developing sustainability goals, establishing what our undesirable results are for this basin, establishing these sustainability thresholds that include minimum thresholds, the lowest level, values, measurable objectives, which are our targets where we'd like to see the basin operated. And then if necessary, if we find that we do have undesirable results, or we have conditions that we are concerned about, we propose some projects and management actions. And you'll see an iteration loop here, that basically, if we find that some of those projects and management actions are not feasible, they're not implementable, they're not affordable for whatever reason, based on our evaluation and based on your input, we would go back and revisit our criteria again to see if we need to make any adjustments. That's only if you find that you have undesirable results. I'm not going to read all of this, but basically, this is a required element, proposing a sustainability goal, which is to manage the groundwater resources in the basin for current and future beneficial uses of groundwater, including the river environment. Through adaptive management, it builds on robust science monitoring, and it considers economic, social, and other objectives for a wide variety of stakeholders. Again, if there's input on this that you think that you'd like to see, we're very open to hear about it. This is kind of where we are right now. So how do you define an undesirable result? We discussed this in the past. Well, for it to be an undesirable result, there has to be a significant or unreasonable effect caused by pumping. And I underline caused by pumping. So that could mean long-term effects on long-term sustainable groundwater production, could mean impacts to other beneficial uses, including GDEs or threatened endangered species. We define an undesirable result if we see an exceedance of these minimum thresholds that we've specified for sustainability, that DWR expects us to establish for the line between sustainable and unsustainable when we have undesirable results. And we establish those at a number of what we call representative monitoring sites or representative wells that we're picking throughout the basin, both for the alluvial aquifer, for the Saugus Formation, and also for areas that we know where we have GDEs. We want to do special monitoring for those. These criteria may be refined based on monitoring data and analyses in the future as more data is obtained, as monitoring data, we improve our understanding of the basin conditions over time. So I'm going to go through some examples of what we've come up with as possible undesirable results. Please let us know if you can think of others or if you observed others in the basin that we haven't captured. So first undesirable result for chronic lowering of groundwater levels in the alluvial aquifer would be that we see water levels drop below the minimum thresholds that we set in our representative wells. And in this case, it would have to be in at least 25% of those representative wells over a 2-year period. We're also concerned about the magnitude or the rate of water level decline. We don't want that to be greater than what we would expect and what we predicted using the groundwater model. And again, in 25% of the representative wells over a 2-year period. And likewise for this indicator, we're concerned about potential impacts to GDEs. And so we built a plan around that. For chronic reduction of groundwater in storage in the alluvial aquifer, and what I mean by groundwater in storage is the amount of water that's present in the pore spaces in the aquifer itself. These are very much tied to water levels in the aquifer. And so as water levels drop, the quantity of groundwater in storage drops. So we want to avoid chronic reduction in that groundwater in storage. And for the alluvial aquifers, we're tying that undesirable result to what we said for groundwater levels. Again, by seeing, as a result of pumping, 25% of the wells that we're monitoring over a 2-year period indicate that we're reducing the volume of groundwater in storage. And the important point here is that we've set thresholds for the alluvial aquifer we'll talk about, and likewise the Saugus, so that we have enough water in that aquifer to get us through a sustained drought, as we've experienced in the past. need to have enough water in the tank, so to speak. So undesirable results for lowering of groundwater levels and reduction in groundwater storage for the Saugus Formation. It's basically groundwater elevations during the peak pumping months, summer months, have dropped below those minimum threshold levels, and this time over 3 consecutive years. The alluvial aquifer and the Saugus Formation together, if we consider the reduction in groundwater storage, if that results in an inability to meet demand during a multi-year drought, that's an undesirable result also. For land subsidence, we're concerned about subsidence, differential subsidence that substantially interferes with surface land uses. So we have deformation causing broken pipes or damaged roads at critical infrastructure in particular, or in other properties. Pumping results in land subsidence greater than the thresholds at 10% of the monitoring locations. So that's what we've come up with as an undesirable result for land subsidence. Apologize for the number of words here. Undesirable result for groundwater quality is a little more involved because we have different standards that we're concerned about and different beneficial uses. So water management actions, those put forth by the GSA that interfere with existing groundwater remediation efforts that could create a permanent loss of groundwater supply or impact of existing plume is a concern. Concentrations of regulated constituents in untreated groundwater from private wells or domestic wells, agricultural wells exceed regulatory thresholds, whether they be basin plan standards or thresholds that are presented in the salt nutrient management plan. Significant and unreasonable loss of municipal supplies due to migration of contaminant plumes and an inability to pump and treat groundwater or reasonably secure an alternative water supply. That's an undesirable result for that beneficial use. So groundwater pumping strategies that cause concentrations of what we call salts and nutrients, which are total dissolved solids, dissolved salts in the water, chloride, nitrate, sulfate, they exceed the water quality objectives for this basin or exceed the basin-wide what we call assimilative capacity, which is the amount of salt that's been established in the salt and nutrient management plan that can be allowed to infiltrate the groundwater. If we see that we've got a problem with loss of assimilative capacity or we're exceeding these salt and nutrient water quality objectives, then that's an undesirable result. So for depletion of interconnected surface water and the impacts to GDEs, what are the undesirable results there? Well, focusing in on the GDEs, a permanent loss or significant degradation of existing native riparian or aquatic habitat due to lower groundwater levels caused by pumping is one undesirable result. Another would be a temporary or acute loss of aquatic habitat at specific locations that are critical to sensitive aquatic species. Again, lowered groundwater levels caused by pumping. An example being unarmored three-spine stickleback that live in the vicinity of pools in the I-5 bridge area. That's a very sensitive spot where acute loss of habitat could be a serious problem and an immediate problem. So those were the undesirable results that we came up with. At this stage now, we're ready to go into the summary of each of the sustainability indicators that we had talked about previously. And I'll go through each one and I'll try to breeze through this because most of it is, well, they're all presented in the report that you're reviewing right now. And you've seen most of this before. So the first threshold, minimum threshold and measurable objective for chronic lowering of water levels. This is measured at representative wells. So for the minimum threshold or that sustainability threshold, it's the lowest predicted water level in our representative wells in the year 2042 that we predicted using the groundwater model. Now, the note here is that if water levels go below historical water levels, measured water levels that we've seen in the past in the alluvial aquifer. And again, as a result of pumping, that could trigger an evaluation and cause evaluation of the cause and include implementation of management actions that avoid impacts to GEEs. That's an important caveat to that, using that lowest predicted 2042 water level. And again, recalling from the water budget work we did, that water level that we predicted using the groundwater model in 2042 and 2072 included full build out of the basin, full demand for that population. It included climate change factors that were provided to us by DWR. So it's really, 2072 is being the worst case scenario out 50 years, and 2042 is the horizon that we're expected to be sustainable, that 20-year horizon from the time we submit our plan. So we just felt that that was a reasonable threshold for water levels. In the water budget work we did showed that according to the operating plan, we pump to meet the operating plan to meet demand in 2042 and 2072. We do not see chronic lowering of water levels. And so we felt, again, that's a reasonable threshold. Could we pump more? Probably so. The measurable objective, which is the target where we want to kind of maintain water levels. So we just basically said it's a water level that provides access to consistent with the operating plan over the historic dry periods. For example, the dry period from 2006 to 2016. The example that I'd like to give for where we would set the measurable objective, which is MO, and the MT, which is minimum threshold. The minimum threshold here in red is set at that lowest predicted water level that we would predict to occur in the year 2042. If we repeated what we've seen in the past in terms of climate, we repeated that same climate regime going forward, and then we superimpose climate change on top of that, this is the predicted low in water level. You can also see where we've set the measurable objective, which is, in this case, it's an average water level for the predicted future case. And this again is for an alluvial observation well. We did the same thing for the Saugus. You can see it has a very different kind of response in water levels, water level hydrograph that you see here. So again, this dark blue line represents the predicted future water level in the year 2042. And so we set that minimum threshold at that lowest predicted level. The measurable objective target would be kind of an average through that period of time. So that just gives you an example of how we would set these at each of our representative wells for evaluating how we're doing with respect to sustainability. So for reduction of groundwater and storage, the second indicator, sustainability indicator. These are very much tied to the groundwater level indicator. As I mentioned, you lower the water table, you also see a reduction in groundwater storage. So the minimum thresholds and the measurable objectives for this indicator are essentially identical to what they would be for the chronic lowering of groundwater levels. Now for the Saugus aquifer, we are considering the minimum threshold for reduction in storage to be kind of an interim level subject to change, because it may be possible at some time in the future, based on our observations, that we could pump the Saugus more to provide for a more resilient supply during drought and without causing undesirable results. But that would have to be evaluated. There'd be a whole process to determine whether that was appropriate. But we've set an initial minimum threshold for the purposes of the GSP. And again, the measurable objectives would be synonymous with what we established for the chronic decline in water levels. For subsidence, we are planning to establish thresholds based on a geotechnical evaluation considering local soils and geology and expected future changes in groundwater levels. And we're going to be coming up with the maximum amount of subsidence that we would expect that, and that might be allowable at critical infrastructure without causing damage. The results of that geotechnical evaluation are not yet available, but will be for the purposes of the finalizing this chapter at some point soon. Clearly, the measurable objective is that we don't want any long-term reduction in ground surface elevation at our subsidence monitoring locations. So for degradation of groundwater quality as an indicator, measured at our representative wells, what we've set for minimum thresholds there have a number of considerations. So recognizing that we have contaminants including chlorate, VOCs, PFAS have been detected over many years in the basin. This contamination predates the enactment of SGMA in January 2015. So there's not an expectation that we're somehow going to restore the basin. It's not the GSA's responsibility to do that. Actually, it's the characterization, monitoring, remediation, all of those efforts are handled by state Regional Water Quality Control Board, the California Department of Toxic Substance Control, and other agencies are responsible for those things, not the GSA. However, we have to deal with the reality of detections of contamination when it comes to municipal drinking water and other sources of drinking water. And so, for example, SCV Water has proactively collaborated with these regulatory agencies and monitored for contamination and installed wellhead treatment when the contamination has been detected or approaches regulatory thresholds. And because the GSA has no authority or responsibility for managing the contamination, we've not established any particular minimum thresholds for those regulated contaminants. Now, notice that I'm speaking about contaminants. We have another set of constituents to be concerned about. They're called salts or nutrients. These dissolved minerals, these dissolved solids, chloride, nitrate, sulfate. We are concerned about increasing concentration of those constituents impacting beneficial uses. And so we've set our minimum threshold measured in 20% of the wells that exceed water quality objectives in the basin, or they exceed the basin-wide assimilative capacity described in that salt and nutrient management plan. And that's for protection of not only drinking water, but also protection of agricultural beneficial uses and domestic and private well uses. Now, for measurable objectives, where do we want to kind of maintain water quality for contaminants? Well, we want to maintain municipal pumping for beneficial uses consistent with the volumes that are planned for in the urban water management plan for wet, normal, or dry periods, multiple dry periods. For non-municipal pumping, whether that's private, domestic, golf courses, agricultural users, domestic users, they should be pumping consistently with what they've done in the past and what's described in the urban water management plan as well. For private wells, domestic wells, we're concerned about the quality of the water, particularly for drinking water. And so we're saying we want the objective to be set at or above the basin standards, the water quality standards for the basin, to preserve high quality, the highest quality beneficial use for that water for private wells. And again, that's assuming that they don't have the ability to install, treatment systems or easily gain access to alternative supplies. So for salts and nutrients, the measurable objective or the target we want to try to reach for these constituents is, again, meeting the water quality objectives and basin-wide assimilative capacity described in the salt and nutrient management plan. We want to be better than those standards as an overall objective. We have lastly here the thresholds for interconnected surface water.
I'm going over to Dawn's for a few minutes.
We've not seen significant and unreasonable surface water depletion as a result of pumping in the past. There are no surface water diversions. And frankly, there's more water in the river now than there has been in the past as a result of urbanization. So actual depletion of surface water has not been a concern. What has been and is a concern now and in the future is avoiding adverse impacts to beneficial uses, which include groundwater dependent ecosystems and the associated sensitive aquatic species. So that's the focus of this particular sustainability indicator in the plan. So to avoid those significant and unreasonable impacts to GDEs, we're establishing groundwater trigger levels. And that's going to result in active monitoring and timely evaluations to inform the management actions to avoid the permanent loss of habitat or those acute impacts to aquatic species at certain locations. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So what are the criteria for avoiding these impacts to the GDEs or groundwater dependent ecosystems? So we've established these action trigger levels, and I'll just review them with you. We discussed them, Tom Barnes discussed them with you in the last meeting we had. So those are groundwater levels within these GDE areas that we've mapped based on the lowest historic water levels that we've seen in the past 40 years. So with the idea being that the vegetation in the plants communities and the habitat has been adapted to these ups and downs based on water level changes, based on climatic changes. And so we felt that as long as the water levels are moving within that zone, that historic water level zone, we should be fine. It's when the water levels drop below historic measured levels, then that's where we have a potential for a problem. We don't know for sure, but that's when a potential might exist. Now, in the sensitive habitat areas, like for example, in the pools around the I-5 bridge, we know we have the unarmored three-spine stickleback fish. And so we are recommending an intermediate trigger. In fact, this was suggested by someone from one of our stakeholder meetings. We're suggesting an intermediate trigger at those sensitive locations at 2 feet above the historic low. And again, we may adjust that depending on seasonal fluctuations, but the idea would be to ensure that we can do an evaluation and respond with a management action in a timely manner before we actually reach the historic low. Now, the measurable objective, where would we like to see water levels? Well, clearly average groundwater levels in the alluvium would, based on what we've seen in the past, would be the best way to ensure we don't have an impact to a GDE. And so these will be measured at our monitoring locations that we're establishing within the GDE area. And in particular, at the sensitive areas where we know we have UTS present, we want to make sure that we're maintaining flow, or at least enough flow in the pools to maintain that aquatic habitat. Because we don't have surface water gauging stations at some of these places like the I-5 bridge, and we're not sure that we can actually get one installed that would give us meaningful data, we're going to be probably using groundwater levels measured in nearby shallow piezometer as a surrogate for what the water level in the pool would be. And we'll develop a correlation of flow in the pool, or elevation of water in the pool with the groundwater level nearby. So that would be something that will be part of this program. So considerations when triggers are reached. There are a number of questions that are going to have to be answered as part of this evaluation. You know, is is that affected river segment supported by surface flow from other means, from other sources of water or water reclamation plant discharges. If there's already surface water flow there, then we're probably going to be less concerned about whether the groundwater levels are dropping, because the trees are in the plants and the vegetation and habitat's going to be supported by the surface water flow. The other question, and again, this is a biologist's question, will the vegetation and sensitive species survive temporary loss of access to groundwater? The question in that particular area. Has that management action trigger been reached often in recent years, and have those levels recovered quickly, and how quickly? Are the declines in groundwater levels resulting from pumping? It's kind of a key issue. And we're already talking about ways in which we can anticipate whether or not that's likely to occur. We can talk more about that later. And then likewise, has there been any new information that could be used to refine the trigger level if we need to, whether it's not high enough or whether we're being too conservative? The key part of this is, particularly in the sensitive areas, is timely management actions. Whether that's shifting pumping or reducing pumping, whatever that's necessary to, if we find that this issue is being caused by pumping, respond quickly so that we can protect the GDEs and not have an undesirable result or an impact. So I'm just going to briefly cover a couple of things just to kind of put some visualism in mind. This map, and it's not ideal. We've got some Google Earth files that we can share with anyone who's interested. What you see here in the green are the actual mapped GDE locations, and likewise in orange, where groundwater has historically been within 30 feet of ground surface. This is the key area that we're concerned about that you see in the green. Now, within that green area, which we're calling the GDE area, we've established some monitoring locations. These would be shallow piezometers installed as close as we can get within those GDE areas. It's not an easy task to figure out how you can site these piezometers and not impact habitat with the equipment. You have to have permission to access this land, and so it's quite an effort to get these installed, but that's what our intention is with this monitoring program along the GDE area. One of the things, we've been talking about thresholds. I want to give you an example of the location here at GDE C, right here, where the blue arrow is. This is the squiggly line that you see here is what we would predict the water level to be, what we predicted to be historically. We don't actually have a monitoring location there. So we're using the groundwater model to give us a feeling of what's going on there. And you can see that it's bounced around quite a bit, but generally speaking, we do have water present in the channel or in pools there, except during periods of extreme drought, which we did see that occurred back in 2015. Now, in areas other than the I-5 bridge, we're going to set the minimum threshold for this at the historic low. At sensitive locations like the I-5 bridge location, we're going to set a trigger level that's a couple feet above this so that we can not have the water level reach this red line. Where we'd like to maintain a measurable objective or keep the water level, we'd like to keep it where this average is right here where you see this green line. I'm just showing you an example of how we might proceed here. Now this is 2 miles downstream of the Valencia Water Reclamation Plant. This GDE-E, which is the blue arrows pointing to that, you can see we have a lot more fluctuation going on here. I don't know if you can see my screen or not. Okay. we have set the minimum threshold at the predicted historic low. But the measurable objective or our target where we want to maintain water levels is here at about the average. So that just gives you a feel for what we're talking about for GDEs. Now, for next steps, we've got this public workshop that Rick mentioned coming up. It's a GSA board meeting, March 10th. And we'd love your feedback on this presentation to improve it. Too much emphasis in one area or graphics, whatever you'd like to see to focus on. There's going to be a meeting on March 24th with this group to debrief following that board meeting and workshop, public workshop. And then there's a GSA meeting on March 25th, which this information, this summary information will be presented and discussed. So that's kind of the game plan for at least this particular topic going forward. And I apologize for the long-windedness, but any questions?
Are there questions or comments for Jeff? I mean, I think it was, as you indicated, we've seen a lot of this in parts over a series of meetings, but I think that was I appreciate it all being put together, pulled together. So are there questions or comments?
I know
from
that
the
Sandra
committee?
has been very patiently waiting with her hand raised for
Great,
like
thank you.
the majority of the presentation.
Sorry, Sandra.
Sandra, go ahead.
You're muted, Sandra.
I perused this earlier, so I had a few questions already that I wanted to catch up on. So the first question I have is everything is tied to triggers if it is caused by pumping. Do we have triggers if it's caused by prolonged drought? So that was the first question.
You want me to go ahead and answer that real quick?
Okay, and then but I do have more questions, yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's fine. So Sigma requires us to be setting triggers and evaluating undesirable results that are caused by pumping. The GSA can decide that it wants to do more than that. So, when it comes to trying to sort out what's in effect caused by pumping versus drought, that's a difficult thing, just to be clear. It's not an easy deal. And we're trying to develop some procedures that would allow us to figure that out. But in the midst of a drought, sorting out what's pumping and what's drought, it's challenging. So we're trying to get there.
Good.
Less, you may decide that, the GSA may decide, you know what, it doesn't matter if it's drought, we want to figure out a way to keep water in there. And that's within the GSA's purview.
I think that's a good approach that we also consider in addition to pumping prolonged drought. On I think it was slide 17, which was I think the Saugus well, where you had, I think we had this discussion before. Yes. Let's see.
Did I go too far?
No, let's go to 17. Back one more. One more. That was earlier. It was before the I-fiber. It was earlier.
Okay, so maybe it was in a different section.
It wasn't. Okay, so let me just explain what the issue was. There was, yeah. Is across the bottom we have where it's labeled through January 20th. And then we have the blue line that supposedly goes through 42. But I think we talked about separating those out, maybe having two different graphs, one on top of the other.
Yeah, I apologize. That was missed here. What we want to do, and this is a good comment, Sandra, is adjust the scale on the bottom, the time scale, to show that we're talking about future, not just through January 2020.
Right. Well, I think if you put both of them up there, it might be confusing. If you had them one on top of the other and then blend them together, So you could show that, first separate and then blend them together. That might be a really good way to do the presentation. I
Thank you.
also wondered, you said we don't have a water flow monitor under I-5. Why can't we have a water flow monitor under I-5?
Well, let's just put it this way. The folks that have looked at it so far have said that it's exceedingly difficult to install at that location. There are a lot of factors that go into setting a gauge that can be reliable, that captures a range of flows that we expect at that location, that won't just get washed away. There are a number of considerations for how you would go about installing a gauge there. I think that the best thing to do if we can install a gauge is to install a gauge. And we'll look at that.
Mm-hmm.
But the fallback is to rely on groundwater if we have to.
And the last one is we talked about, water levels hitting that threshold in 25% of wells to actually be a trigger. And that was earlier. And I'm wondering why why 25% was picked. I know there are some wells on the east end that are dry. And it seems that for that area, that should be a trigger in that area. I know you're not pumping out of that well anymore because you can't. But it doesn't mean that you can't in the future. And that might be an area that can be rewatered.
So there are a couple of things built into your question there. One is, why did we choose 25%? And essentially, we wanted to avoid a situation where one or two wells showed that we were below a threshold. So we wanted to avoid that condition so that we triggered a whole unsustainable action, an action to address sustainability because of one or two wells. So we picked 25% overall because that indicates in the overall network of representative wells that are going to be spaced throughout the basin that we've got an unsustainable situation on our hands. And DWR gives us flexibility to define it that way. Whether the number should be 10% or 25%, I guess we could debate about that. We felt like 25% was a good number given the number of wells we actually have available to us to monitor, particularly in the Saugus. We just don't have that many wells. The other.
What does that translate to in numbers, Jeff?
Let's see. If we have 6 operational Saugus wells. John, are you on the line? You could perhaps answer that.
Yeah, it is 6 Saugus operational wells, and I believe it's 14 in the alluvial aquifer, if I remember correctly.
So you can already see that if we have a problem in just a couple of Saugus wells, we've kind of we're at our threshold. It doesn't take too many wells with the number of wells we have in our program. And we're anticipating over time that we're going to be adding wells. We'd like to, in fact, I'm sure we're adding wells. We're already planning on it. So there'll be more wells that will be in the population associated with that 25%. Your second question about what about getting more water into the east end? Clearly what we've observed in the past has been during drought periods or low rainfall periods, the wells further to the east experience lowered water levels. It's just part of what we've discussed with the draining out of that alluvial aquifer. To try to bring water back to that east end is exceedingly difficult. Ideas about bringing state water or some other water and recharging further upstream, has been considered. It's an issue of expense to a large extent versus the benefit that you get from a supply perspective of trying to do that. Maybe you're better off putting your investment in other wells that during drought you could rely on that are more, that frankly have more water in them and don't drain, the aquifer doesn't drain out or it's not too thin. So that's, again, that's a supply issue. I'm not sure, you know, I don't, at least in my opinion, it's not worth trying to bring water all the way up to the east end to restore those wells when we know that there's problems with them anyway. Maybe we should be thinking about other sources of supply in the basin, including the Saugus, to make up the difference.
Well, maybe we could keep water for running down from that area in, you know, like stormwater capture in that area to increase the amount of water that goes in on that side. It may slide down, you know, the slippery slope, as you might say, but it's still going in that part of the of our area.
Well, again, you know, if the priority of the GSA is to restore the water levels in those, for example, in the Pine Tree wells and the wells on the east end, then that could become a project and management action. Is that, you know, something that severely impacts the sustainability overall, the supply in the basin? Maybe not.
Okay.
There's other alternatives to make up for the difference.
I would still like to consider that because sustainability is not just for the water district. Sustainability also has to do with people with individual wells in that area. So I still think we should be looking into it and see if there's cost-effective management practices that we might be looking at. I know this is a little bit into the future and we're just gathering data right now, but I know there's the storage capacity in that area because obviously there was a producing well there. I know I'm thinking of the Sand Canyon well in the middle of the river. And I know that there's the capacity for water to be in that area.
One of the things that we have to think about, and I did see, and I'm respectful of your comments about this, some of the wells that we may have seen water in at some time in the past, it might have been because it was during a wet period. You know, there's been periods, decade-long periods where we've seen above average rainfall. So we do see in the alluvium especially, it recovers quickly and we see water there. But likewise, during periods of drought, which is very prevalent in this area, as you know, those water levels drop out and we have to adapt and do something different. And that's our challenge with this basin, particularly on the east end.
Thank you for taking all my questions.
Sure, yeah.
I think they were good questions and things for us to talk about as we do get into the programs and management actions, projects, et cetera. Tara, does anybody else put their hand up here? Raise their hand.
Matt Carpenter and Dan Misnato.
Carpenter.
You choose.
Mr. Carpenter?
Hi there. My question, Jeff, is regarding, you were going through the wells along the axis of the river that you would use for triggers as it relates to GDEs. And I was wondering how the relationship of gaining or losing reaches, more importantly, factors into where you put some of those monitoring locations, because hydrologically, if the stream is discharging to groundwater, you know, one, the groundwater elevation is responding to that surface water discharging to it. So it's kind of a surface water driven component as opposed to a groundwater driven one. So I'm just trying to get my head around the logic there. Are we putting trigger locations in losing reaches? Because most of the losing reaches, you know, upstream of where flows are perennial, those are areas that don't have very dense groundwater dependent systems. There's not a lot of vegetation there. And if some of these systems are kind of, you know, it's the relationship between surface water and groundwater, I think, that gets a little bit complicated.
You're absolutely right, Matt. So there's a few considerations there. yes, it is important to understand whether you're in a gaining or losing reach. We know, for example, on the west end, within your properties, we know that the Saugus Aquifer discharges into the alluvium and ultimately into the river. So the river is gaining in that location most of the time. And that does support vegetation, riparian vegetation, the GDEs. So we also see a lot less fluctuation in water level in that area from the wells that we have access to. There are some losing locations in between, the east end and that west end, which are losing for a lot of different reasons, including the changes in thickness of the alluvium. So the water kind of fills up. The zone takes more water to fill it up, so to speak, so it's losing. There's also evidence of water levels that come up because there's bedrock, the Saugus Formation is coming up, and so the alluvium gets really thin, and so the water has to come up and sometimes discharge to the river. So there's a lot of complicated factors. The way in which just to be frank, there's a lot of information that we wish we had. Our intention with those piezometers and the temperature probes that you know about that we've been wanting to install was to better understand that dynamic, to help us better plan for where we want to put piezometers and monitoring locations so that we could get a better feel for where those gaining and losing reaches are. Right now, we're having to infer based on monitoring locations that are fairly spread out. We infer it based on what you did on where the vegetation is. That tells a good part of the story. So we would like to, fill in the gaps here with piezos and instrumentation to better understand the dynamics in these areas, particularly where you just don't have the data.
Okay, thanks.
But it's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up because it is definitely important for how we choose to set thresholds. And to be, the other thing to add to that, I would just add, I think John Porcello is probably wishing I would add. We've got this kind of dynamic built into the groundwater flow model. It helps us determine where the river is gaining and where it's losing. And so we've used the model to help us infer some of these locations as well.
Yeah, I think Jeff, you said it well. And I think the only other thing I would mention is that the, types of GDEs, the exact mixture of different species might be a little different from one place to another. For example, in a spot where the river is losing, the groundwater table is deeper, may have a little bit different plant mixture than a spot where the water table is, really close to ground surface and water's a little more easily accessed. So the whole idea is that, in a losing reach, you may see a trigger level that's somewhat deeper below ground surface and is therefore reflective that you have a habitat that is used to that depth versus in another spot, your trigger level may be a lot closer to ground surface, reflecting a type of habitat that's been used to that condition.
Matt, I wanted to add one more point to what John was saying, and that is, these triggers that we've been talking about for GDEs are based on model projected water levels and in some cases actual measured water levels in deeper agricultural wells and other monitoring wells. They're not ideal for this purpose. So we've been kind of using what we had available to us. We're expecting as part of this process, and we will describe in our plan, the methodology by which when we install a shallow piezo, which has this very specific objective of understanding the shallow groundwater within the GDE area, we're expecting that we're going to need to do some analysis to correlate what we actually observe in those newly installed wells at wherever we can get them installed and what we predicted would occur at that location. So we're probably going to end up adjusting some of these thresholds based on what we actually observe in those locations. And we're describing that and making it clear in the plan. We needed to start somewhere. Good questions.
Others questions from the committee?
I think did we answer Dan's question? Dan,
didn't ask
Dan's
it
waving
yet.
his hand.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
I have a couple, 3 points, and then one question or clarification. The first point, actually, I think it's a correction to the sustainability goal. If you could go to slide 7. There you go. It's not a major one. Well, as far as a change or correction is concerned, it's not a major one, but it does impact the what we're trying to communicate here. I think there's a comma that needs to be added after river environment. Does that make sense? Because I've read it a couple of times and I go, wait a minute, there's something that's not quite right here. And I believe the comma's missing there.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. And then
Hey, Dan, can I interrupt you for a second? Because before we go on to another topic, I had a comment on this as well. And Jeff, maybe this might not be something that needs to change before the workshop, but I don't certainly want to get into, wordsmithing, but it feels a little bland to me. I mean, I don't feel like it is like you could almost swap in any river system to the sentence. And I feel like we might want to say some things that reflect our community. And again, I don't want this to end up either being a page long either, but something that reflects, we are a community with, sort of this type of ecosystem, and we're a growing community, but we're not on the ocean. I mean, I'm not sure, what all needs to be in there, and maybe we don't get to that until we've gone into some of the management actions and programs discussion, but I just sort of wanted to put a pin in that it doesn't say anything to me as a layperson. And we might want to enrich this a little bit and revisit it maybe as the plan and recommendations come more full circle. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments. The truth of it is we have borrowed from other places when we put this together. And so we appreciate the input. I guess, with this goal that we see there, DWR actually expected that we refine this and improve it over time, such that by the time it gets into the GSP, it's had an opportunity to go through a process with stakeholders. So I appreciate that, Holly. If you wanted to send me your, an edited version of something that you think is more appropriate, I'd love to see it.
Well, I'll certainly give it some thought, and it may be that, we wait until we're through this next stakeholder meeting and we've had some discussion of some other components, but it just doesn't quite seem like, I do think that we want something to be that speaks to our community and our needs, because that's what makes it resonate and makes it more actionable.
Okay.
Anyway, comment enough. Dan, you had some other comments. Back to you. Thanks for letting me jump in.
Oh, no problem. One real quick aside, you don't have to go to the slide. I think it was on 18 or something. You refer to the Saugus Aquifer. I mean, I think for purposes of the public, we ought to consistently use Saugus formation to minimize any confusion, but then that's a minor item.
Yeah, no, we've been trying to catch that, and thank you, Dan. You're
Okay.
right.
And two more things. One is, Sandra raised the point about, or made the point about the East Stand, and I think one of the things that I think you've been trying to explain, Jeff, is that basically you're describing the natural condition up there. To try and move water up there is not only expensive and actually would involve a lot of pumping and whatnot and the environmental impacts of that, but it would result in what's not a natural condition. It's not something that I think would be a goal of the GSA, but then that's just my opinion, my thought. The one other item I wanted to go to, Sandra had mentioned about, and I don't know if I understood it correctly, about addressing or incorporating the impact of prolonged drought as far, not just adjusting pumping impacts. And I think actually the prolonged drought, to the extent it would occur, would actually result in a change in not the historical, but future projections as far as the ground level, water levels are concerned. In other words, the graph themselves, and then the pumping obviously would need to be adjusted or reduced based on that revised hydrograph. Is that correct, Jeff, or am I missing something?
Well, I think you're starting to get to, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're starting to get to where our team has, not just the consultant team, but SCV team has been really thinking hard about, from a practical perspective, how are we going to evaluate groundwater levels, and particularly sorting out pumping effects from climate effects. So we're doing some sensitivities with the groundwater model. We're thinking about, well, can we do some proactive pumping tests where we can actually, after we've installed our monitoring locations in the GDE area, we test pump certain wells that are close by so we can understand better what's immediately affecting that location versus not. So when we do run into a problem, you know, with, for example, if we do see water levels dropping to our trigger levels, we'll actually have a better idea of what to do about it, whether it's adjusting pumping, reducing pumping in a well, or shutting it off altogether, or redistributing pumping. We'll have a much better idea ahead of time. And that's that's the thinking we're going through right now. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, yeah, I think you did. I think you did. It's yeah. Ultimately, it is about, you know, ultimately it's about adjusting the pumping in response to whatever condition you have. And if the projection of future conditions changes from what is currently the case, what is the current projection, you would simply update the projection and then adjust your pumping as needed moving forward. It's a living, breathing document. I see.
That's exactly right. And our intention is, as we get more monitoring points and more data, it will allow us to calibrate the model even better to do this predictive work as well. So we're getting a lot of experience both with real-time monitoring, what's happening, with some proactive testing that I mentioned, and then the model work to help us figure out the best move. There's no point in shutting down pumping or reducing pumping if that's not the effect. If it's if it's climate, right? So this is the challenge we're having, is what areas are really being affected by pumping versus those that aren't.
Well, the benefit we have here in the Valley is that, it's not it's a question of fine tuning the operating plan the agency already has in effect. And, and I commend you, the staff and the consultants, for the work that you've done so far.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly.
Okay, are any other waving hands or hands on the participant screen? I don't see any on the participant list.
There's not a participant list. I'm trying to see. I don't see any SOS signs, so I think we're good.
Okay, are there any public comments? You can proceed to that.
Everyone has been unmuted. You are welcome to either raise your hand or ask a question.
Okay, I guess we will assume that is nobody wants to speak for public comment. Since this goes next to the stakeholder meeting, is there, Rick or Tara, is there something, is this an action item, or is this mostly discussion now until our subsequent meeting?
Thanks, Holly. This is discussion. We've been getting your feedback today, which has been helpful. And we'll take that and we'll make some adjustments to this PowerPoint. I really liked your suggestion about talking more about the community in the river, so we can include that for the March 10th workshop. And so happy to keep discussing. It doesn't sound like we've had additional public comment at this point.
Right. Okay, then with, oh shoot, where'd my Zoom go? With that, then I believe our next item is to see whether there's any requests for future agenda items by any member of the committee.
No, although, did we want to review the handout? Or are we just going to send that out to people to review?
I think we can send out unless Rick or, you or Jeff want to do a quick review.
I'm fine with just sending out, that way people can sit with it and read it.
Yeah.
I would just need changes by next Wednesday.
Okay, so when you send out, if you can put that deadline in bold,
Yep,
top of the email or the subject line, that's always
absolutely.
helpful. Okay, so then back to item 4. Any other items for future meetings? Great, then we will see folks at the stakeholder meeting. Encourage everybody to participate, and then we have a subsequent meeting a couple weeks after that for us to begin, keep moving the approval process forward. So I want to thank everybody for their input and their attention on this. Do please take a look at the handout, get some fresh eyes on that for Tara and the team. And with that, I believe we are adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks,
Have a
everyone.
great evening,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
All righty, bye-bye.